The fabled city of Atlantis. Myths and legends speak of her beauty, her majesty, her technological achievements. Her story has dazzled hearts and minds, found its way into popular culture, and, for a time, perplexed scholars. Despite once enjoying time in the spotlight, not many still believe in the possibility of such a place. Such stories spring up for all sorts of reasons, and we automatically assume they are made up, because we have no frame of reference, no precedent for such things. Such grand ideas do not seem to fit within our reality, when weighed against the personal experience of most people. Yet, one must ask oneself, is this a sufficient basis to determine absolutely that such stories are false? One must ask oneself, is it only possible that such a place once existed, but has unfortunately been lost to the flowing waters of time? You might be inclined to say, no, it cannot possibly be. However, there is ever-increasing evidence that may just give you cause to think again. Mounting evidence converges on a single cohesive story. One where all the pieces of the puzzle begin to lock tightly into place. The hunt for Atlantis begins with Plato, a man highly revered for his scholarship. Yet, in the case of his account of Atlantis, his scholarship is brushed aside. But Plato was a truly intelligent man, and perhaps his account merits a more serious examination, especially as additional facts have more recently come to light. Plato, around 340 BC, tells us a story, passed down in his family of his ancestor, Solon, who went to visit priests in Egypt in 600 BC. They told him of a great civilization that was destroyed in a great cataclysm involving both fire and a massive flood, which submerged it beneath the sea. And they said also that its survivors were the progenitors of Egypt. It is important to note, for later, that when asked by Solon, the priests told him, its destruction occurred 9,000 years ago. That would have been in 9,600 BC. 11,600 years ago. An intriguing story, indeed. But critics of the Atlantis myth claim that there is no evidence to support Plato's claim. If there was such a great civilization, one would expect there to be other sources of information pointing to it. Well, what if there are? But what if their age has distorted such accounts so that they are not obvious at first glance? The story of Noah's flood is well known, and has been suggested as evidence for the existence of Atlantis, where the flood was the catalyst for the city's destruction. In the story, the wicked are destroyed and a choice few are saved by virtue of their, virtue. Plato gives us a hint that may tie these stories together. As Plato said, the Atlanteans fell out of harmony with the universe. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation. However, a flood of that scale would certainly yield more than one story. Yet most hold Noah's Ark to be a standalone story. Just another mythological tale. Yet, what happens to a flimsy, intangible myth, when similar stories start cropping up all over the world? How many eerily similar myths need to seemingly corroborate the same event, before one has to wonder if it is no mere coincidence? Noah, warned by God to build a ship to survive a worldwide flood, manages to save his family from the destruction of the wicked, eventually landing elsewhere and repopulating the earth. A solitary story, right? Maybe not. Take the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known flood account, which predates the alleged timeframe of the recording of Noah's story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim was instructed by divine beings to collect 2 of every animal to be brought aboard a large cubic boat. After sailing a good while, Utnapishtim sent out a dove and a swallow to look for land, but to no avail. The birds returned before sunset. He then sent out a raven, which found dry land. The ship landed on Mount Ararat, in modern-day Turkey. Utnapishtim, with his family and some choice crew members, left to go scouting. Eventually, when the rest of the people on board went looking for them, a voice from the sky informed them that Utnapishtim and his family had been taken to dwell with the gods for their service. The story has striking resemblances to Noah's story, beyond what is reasonable to think is a coincidence. Yet, these are not the only two such stories. In the Hindu tradition, according to the Shatapatha Brahmana, a man called Manu was instructed by Lord Vishnu to build a large boat and secure a male and female of every species of animal. He eventually tied the boat to the horn of a great fish, who pulled the boat to the Himalayas, where Manu built an offering to Vishnu. The Greeks tell of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who were warned by Deucalion's father, Prometheus, that Poseidon was very upset with humanity, because someone had used a small boy as an offering to Zeus, and was going to send a flood to wipe them from the earth. Again, a story wherein the wicked are destroyed. Prometheus and his family were instructed to build a very large boat. This they did, and floated until they ran into the peak of Mount Parnassus. They were then instructed to toss rocks onto the earth, which sprouted into the new generation of humanity, again suggesting the repopulation of Earth. Even the Navajo Indians, and many, if not all of the American Indian tribes, have a similar myth. They hold, via the Dinui Bahane, that the children of a water-dwelling serpent god were kidnapped by a coyote. The next morning, a giant flood is upon them. Fortunately, in this story, two divine beings show up and build a boat of reeds, to save the people, and all the animals. The list of similar flood stories goes on. The Aztecs have a family hollow out a tree and survive the flooded earth, going on to repopulate the earth. The Norse tell that when Odin, father of Thor, slew the primal giant Ymir, the whole world was flooded with his blood, and a frost giant called Bergelmir and his wife made an ark, were saved, and repopulated the earth. Buddhists have their flood story, the Chinese also, the Aborigines, the Acadians, and it goes on, and on. Perhaps, despite the staggering odds, all the world's cultures, across the globe, across time, were simply parroting the same ancient story. But the trail of evidence does not end there. The Egyptian temple of Edfu bears records upon its walls of the histories and traditions of Egypt. Among its many inscriptions, is a little-known, but crucial account of the peopling of Egypt. It tells us that the ancient Egyptians themselves held that their civilization was not of their own merit but was a legacy passed to them by an older, more advanced civilization, some of whom survived a great cataclysm, sailed to Egypt, and resettled. This confirms Plato's account of what the Egyptian priests told Solon. As intriguing as all these stories are, they cannot stand on their own as proof of anything, let alone Atlantis. Certainly, if a cataclysm did occur on such a grand scale as to submerge a whole civilization under the water, the geological record would show this. Wouldn't it? Well, just maybe, it does. Geologists have, in more recent decades, pinpointed an epoch following the last great ice age, which is called the Younger Dryas. This 1,200-year period of warming was sandwiched by periods of massive flooding and cold. The world rapidly warmed after the Ice Age, but after 1,200 years, the planet was suddenly and violently thrust back into a deep freeze in just a few years, before gradually warming again. The ending of this period, known as Meltwater Pulse 1b, can easily be identified via land formations across the United States, which can only result from water flow. Yet these formations are thousands of times larger than what we are used to seeing, which is why they were not identified for what they are, until very recently, when technology allowed us to view them from high up in the air. Geology expert Randall Carlson has been instrumental in bringing awareness of these formations and their potential ramifications. In areas such as Camas Prairie, we see ripples, like we see on riverbeds and beaches, produced by flowing water, but on an unbelievable scale, hundreds of feet long and 50 feet high. The height of the flood is clearly etched into the mountainsides, a clear record of the sheer volume of water that swept over the North American continent. As Randall Carlson explains, this was an inconceivable amount of water, a tsunami, in excess of every river on Earth flowing together, and yet many times that. In Potholes Cataract, in Washington state, we see flood wash that has carved away the ground hundreds of feet deep, and potholes, carved by high-intensity underwater vortexes, caused by turbulent, rushing water, which are half a mile wide. The evidence of flowing water, on an unimaginable scale in ancient America, is indisputable. These massive scars in the landscape could not be explained for many years. The ancient Clovis culture disappeared, the population of North America dropped dramatically. At the same time, 75% of North American mammals went extinct in a very short period of time, sometime within the period of the Younger Dryas. Mammoths found knocked over, flash frozen, their food still in their mouths, legs broken as if hit by something moving incredibly fast. However, in light of ever-increasing data in recent decades, we have seen the emergence and development of a new theory, called the Younger Dryas Comet Impact Hypothesis. We now have an explanation of all these things. The flood stories, the animal extinctions, the massive scars in the landscape, as well as an explanation for the strange and previously unexplainable details of the mysterious Younger Dryas epoch. Evidence found across 5 continents, 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface has been found to contain melt glass, nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, and other kinds of debris that all point to one thing: a massive impact on the Earth's surface by a freaking huge comet, perhaps 100 kilometers wide, a small moon, which fragmented into many large pieces. One or more of these pieces smashed someplace on the enormous North American ice sheet, with an estimated power of 8 megatons of dynamite per square kilometer, causing a catastrophic melting of a large area of the 2-mile-thick ice instantly, and sending a 1,000-foot tsunami. Riddled with rock and mammoths, entire forests, and gargantuan icebergs, carrying house-sized boulders, across the continent. I mean, like, holy shit. The immense energy and heat of the comet impact on the ice sent water vapor, on an unimaginable scale, into the atmosphere, around much of the Earth, causing a heavy rainout for days, if not weeks. 10 million square miles of the Earth's surface was submerged under rising sea levels, roughly the area of Europe and China combined. Interestingly, all of the comet-specific debris particles are found together in the same layer of soil, along with ash of what is believed to be a staggering 10% of the entire biomass of the planet at the time of impact, burned by superheated ejection, which was thrown into the air and settled all over the continent. Scientists have dated the Younger Dryas black mat layer to know exactly when the comet hit. And it just so happens that this cataclysmic comet impacted the Earth 12,800 years ago, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, almost conclusive proof of the comet hypothesis. And we see the same atmospheric anomalies at the end of the Younger Dryas epoch, including a sudden rise in global temperature, suggesting another impact by fragments of the same comet, and another cataclysm, 11,600 years ago. Exactly the date that Plato gave us for the destruction of Atlantis, which was said to be destroyed by a cataclysmic flood. Coincidence? The recent redating of the Great Sphinx by Dr. Robert Schoch, due to heavy water erosion at its base, coincides perfectly with this time period as well. Is it possible that the heavy rain from the comet impact is the source of the erosion? It is noteworthy that immediately following this global catastrophe is the period in which mainstream history places the very origins of civilization, whether it's agriculture, languages, animal domestication, or laws or cities. They all spring up at the same time. Yet another staggering coincidence perhaps. Or Is it possible that these developments came as a response to a global reset only very shortly prior? It is obvious that Plato would not have had knowledge of the Younger Dryas epoch and the global evidence of a massive comet impact. So ask yourself, is it more likely, by a staggering coincidence, that his Atlantis destruction date and the comet impact both point to exactly the same time? Or is it more likely that the oral tradition passed down to Plato about the great civilization was simply true? Would such a civilization not be important enough that people would strive to keep its memory alive? Perhaps most intriguing behind all this information is the recent geological evidence in the mid-Atlantic. Plato points to a source for Atlantis somewhere in what is now the Atlantic Ocean. As it happens, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which runs up the entire Atlantic Ocean, marks the convergence of tectonic plates, 3 of which merge in a spot called the Azores Plateau. This point, in the middle of the northern Atlantic Ocean, is far elevated above most of the seafloor. It is also very mountainous, even as Atlantis is described. Furthermore, we now know, due to an expedition of the Azores Plateau, that this area was once above water, as samples taken from the plateau included granitic detritus, which can only be formed out of water, as well as beach sand which can only be produced on land at sea level. As the plateau sits on major fault lines, it is not at all far-fetched to suggest that a massive comet, impacting one of the tectonic plates, would cause it to wobble on its molten liquid lava bed, causing massive destruction to anything on its fault lines, including perhaps the Azores Plateau, and would likely even have opened that very seam up to major volcanic activity. Nor is it at all far-fetched this violent shift could have caused the plate to shift permanently, sending the Azores Plateau downward in elevation, even beneath the ocean's surface. Beyond this, it is agreed by scientists that the melting of the massive ice sheet would have released enough water to raise the world's oceans by hundreds or even thousands of feet, sending our proposed resting place of the capital city of Atlantis even further below the surface. Believed to have been a sprawling civilization, stretching across much of the Atlantic coastlines of multiple continents, the civilization resembled perfectly the Atlantis described by Plato. And in fact, dozens and dozens of man-made ancient stone sites and monuments and ruins have been found hundreds of feet below sea level. Sadly, they are not being looked at in a summative context. Yet, the evidences keep stacking up. How many are needed before a coincidence is mathematically impossible? There's one more ancient story I haven't yet told you. The story of Yima is found in the Avestan literature of Zoroastrian tradition, which perhaps dates back as early as the 6th century BC. Yima is believed to be the first man and first king on earth. To start with, there is no flood, and instead of Yima constructing a seagoing vessel, in which he houses the animal kingdom and his immediate family, he is instructed by Ahura Mazda to make a Var, a subterranean fortress or city, so that the Iranian race, and all creatures, could survive the foretold fatal frost, and the perpetual snow, that was said to have raged in the world during this mythical age. There seems little doubt that the so-called fatal winter, preserved in Iranian literature, refers to the final stage of the last ice age, referred to in modern times as the Younger Dryas. Between the global flood myths, Plato's account, its correspondence with the Younger Dryas and myriad geological evidences all converging on the same point, not only does the case for Atlantis become possible, but probable. But a probability that, unfortunately, most mainstream scientists and archaeologists are not willing to consider, partly because they are invested in other models, and partly because their global historical paradigm cannot account for such grand ideas. Yet, to those who have an open mind and who are willing to look, it becomes apparent, as Graham Hancock has said, that we are looking at a lost chapter of human history. It is time to accept it and move forward. The evidence overwhelmingly points to the passing on of great knowledge by an older civilization, to less advanced peoples, such as we see with Göbekli Tepe, South America, Egypt, and others. And remember that they themselves insisted they were the inheritors of knowledge from an older and greater civilization. People everywhere are starting to see for themselves the obvious fact that there is something big we are missing about our history. People like Randall Carlson, Johanna James, and Graham Hancock. It is time to wake up to our true past, to stop ignoring the surmounting evidence, stop disputing whether there is a forgotten chapter in human history, and agree to go in search of it. If no one else does, we hope you at least will. Thanks again for watching, and for being willing to look.